Life keeps forcing cruel choices. We do what we must.
Among its myriad of accomplishments, Expedition 33 will be remembered for containing one of the most polarizing endings in gaming, but also one of the deepest. And I don't only mean deepest as in the most profound, I mean it quite literally, as in the deeper you explore, the more that's revealed, but the less clear your view of the surface becomes. Expedition 33's story, all the way up through its climax, carries the legacy of the Japanese role-playing games that inspired it. Corrupt deities belittle the value of mortal life and threaten to destroy everyone based on that discrimination. It's up to a few underdogs to challenge the gods and fight for whatever small scrap of life they have left. Like those that came before, it's about the power of human will, the strength of your chosen family, and the importance of life enduring, no matter how trivial those lives may be. However, in its final moments, Expedition 33 flips this on its head, instead challenging the player to think more deeply about these ideas and really question at what point the value of our lives may diminish in comparison to existential complexities. This all comes to a head when you must choose between two ethical positions, which each lead to a different ending. You have to choose whether to honor the JRPGs of the past by fighting for the survival of the canvas the world exists within, or to let it fade away, so that those lost in its grasp can finally rest and face the grief they've been running from. What at first seems to be a fairly straightforward moral dilemma between abusing escapism and confronting grief head-on, slowly morphs into a maze of complex ethical conundrums, warping catharsis into confliction, desolation into contentment, and has slowly turned a discourse defined by love bombing into one rife with anger and infighting. Which is understandable for a pair of endings that can be interpreted as tackling intense moral topics such as suicide, genocide, consciousness, mortality, grief, disability, speciesism, and slavery. Another aspect that makes the endings challenging is that even if you appreciate either one as a narratively appropriate tragedy where the character you're rooting for loses, the only way for you to receive that ending in your playthrough is by actively choosing to morally support and fight as the character that opposes your viewpoint. If you view the ending you get as a tragedy, that means you do not support the morality of the character you'd have to choose in order to see that ending in the actual game rather than on YouTube. Meaning while that tragic ending might be satisfying in a linear medium such as movies or TV, or even in a video game without multiple endings, it's essentially inaccessible to you in its current form, without forcing you to fight as someone you do not want to win. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad use of the medium since it adds yet another layer of moral challenge, but it's certainly conflicting if the ending you prefer doesn't align with your moral opinion, since it may leave you feeling punished for which position you chose to support. I think this exposes a limitation of multiple choice endings from a game and narrative design perspective. If an ending is tragic, this generally means the protagonist lost. So hypothetically, if an ending is the result of a choice the player and protagonist are actively making, and then that choice leads to them failing to enforce their moral perspective, it changes the entire concept of choosing an ethical side and removes player agency. In this hypothetical scenario, you no longer get to choose your outcome, and that could be artistically powerful, but that's not what Expedition 33 does. If you fight as Mael, her perspective wins, and if you fight as Verso, Verso's perspective wins. But then if the actual ending that follows that choice doesn't end up feeling cathartic or satisfying, you find yourself at an emotional impasse.
That's your problem. You think in false dichotomies. It wasn't an either-or situation. Other solutions were possible if you'd only trusted us enough to ask.
The two endings are made all the more polarizing due to the way each one is edited. The way they use tone and music suggests, at least on a surface level, that the player should feel discontentment from one of the endings and catharsis from the other. But I challenge you to look beneath the surface, beyond the powerfully manipulative languages of music and cinema, to question what is really happening in each scenario and the ethical costs involved. I can't say if the writers did this on purpose, but I feel that both of these endings emotionally convey a different perspective than the facts that lie underneath.
He who guards truth with lies.
And that if you challenge yourself to push past this top-layer artistry, there are many introspective ideas that can add to your appreciation of the storytelling. and maybe also help you empathize with those who chose a different ending than you, who may have an equally valid perspective. Because at the end of the day, if a game director includes two very binary multiple-choice endings, it's likely not because one is true or good and the other is false or bad, it's because they both contribute to the ideas being explored, and in my opinion, both endings include light and dark, also known in French as clair obscur. Before we can begin forming moral opinions about the game's final choice and the two endings it leads to, we must ask ourselves two questions that completely transform the ethical conundrums present in both options. And those questions are about whether or not the painted characters in the canvas are sentient, or for lack of a better term, have souls. And then similarly, what value we place on the power source of the canvas, the partial soul of young Verso, in comparison to the inhabitants of the canvas. Since question 2 relies heavily on our answer to question 1, we'll start with question 1. Since Expedition 33's world directly involves the concept of souls, I'm going to use the term soul interchangeably with sentience, regardless of my own feelings toward the concept in real life. So let's ask ourselves, do Gustave Ciel, Lune, Painted Verso, Monoko, and the Gesturals, and the residents of Lumiere, and the Grandis, and everyone else have souls, or are they merely illusions? Works of art that, just like the real world, cause us to feel profound emotions, add meaning to our lives, but that no matter how real they may seem, are still only fabrications of our imagination. I could be wrong since I've only played through the game once and rewatched a couple of scenes here and there, but as far as I can tell, the game avoids directly confirming whether painted characters are identical in their sentience to those who reside in the outside world. The painted characters are described as those who know not that they are not, but this could either be interpreted as implying that they're not real, or simply as dismissing the value of lowly creations in comparison to their all-powerful creators. There are also two notable lines spoken by young Verso's soul after fighting Clea in the Flying Manor. He says, "For me, everything in this canvas is as much alive as what is outside. Esquier, the Gesturals, the Grandis, even Aline's paintings." At first glance, you might see this as a confirmation that they're sentient, but I don't personally read it like that. I interpret "for me" as the key phrase here, meaning that this could be a young boy choosing to see immense value in this world and its inhabitants. The art he created gives him meaning, and views it at least as meaningful to him as the outside world is. Maëlle Alicia, let's call her Malicia, even echoes this sentiment to Verso when he first says that all of them are make-believe.
Staying here so long in a make-believe world with her make-believe family.
It's not make-believe. It's not. You're not. To me.
However, Renoir says to Verso soon after,
Some of Eline's finest work. I regret that it caused you so much pain. What Eline did was unfair to you most of all. Please, accept the Descendre family's apologies.
So plenty of evidence both for and against. Now, just to be clear, I do currently lean towards interpreting them as being fully sentient, but for the sake of thoroughly understanding the narrative, let's explore the idea that they are not. When you interpret the world inside the canvas as being analogous to a painting in our world, the game takes on a very metatextual meaning. An artist pours themselves into their art, metaphorically imbuing it with a part of their soul. When they die, their legacy lives on through their works, and those that come after can experience a bittersweet reflection when they gaze upon it. If the painted people are not sentient, the ultimate choice the player and Maëlle are forced to make is less about how we treat sentient beings inside fabricated worlds, and more about what the fabricated world and people inside the canvas mean to Maëlle. And it's also asking what art in general and the video game Clair Obscur Expedition 33 mean to you. Can art be meaningful enough to choose to experience it instead of a tragic life in which you have debilitating injuries and disabilities? Or is facing your real life, no matter how challenging, always the correct option? Does family matter more than escapism, even when said family has essentially abandoned you? Is an attempt at real healing in a world that, as far as you know, truly exists, more important than actually being happy, surrounded by a chosen family that, at the very least, gives the illusion of pure, unconditional love? When I take a step back and view this story as a whole, and especially when I consider that this is a work of the fantasy genre, I personally find this interpretation remarkably fitting. However, I totally understand that accepting that the world you've been fighting for over the course of dozens of hours isn't quite real is a pretty big letdown for a lot of people. I sympathize and even in large part agree with that sentiment, and we'll get more into that in a bit, but I also think that this interpretation of the story adds an extra layer of meaning that a more sentience-based interpretation does not. For one, no matter what way you look at it, none of the characters in this game are real because it is just a video game. So by tying the meaning behind these characters to what they mean to us, it challenges us to overcome our aversion to "it was just a dream" revelations because, as Dumbledore said,
"Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry. Why should that mean that it's not real?"
On a more personal note, my experience playing through this game was all-encompassing. I was utterly addicted to the point of neglecting my own health and life, at least somewhat. I'd order delivery instead of cooking, skip my daily walks, and sit on the couch for so many hours that my back would ache. So when the game challenged my addiction to this world and asked if it would be for the long-term good to say goodbye to it, I felt like a French philosopher reached out of the TV and slapped me across the face with a baguette. It takes a lot of guts to tell a story about the power of effective stories, because if it's not a great story, it will fall flat on its face. Thankfully, Expedition 33 is exceptional, and so this approach pays dividends. I think stories are at their best when they take advantage of the medium they're written for, so I always love when the player's experience playing a video game is mirrored in the protagonist's internal journey. That's a feeling unique to playing a game, and in the case of Expedition 33, is an experience I won't soon forget. Now, within the context of viewing the painted characters as non-sentient, I do personally think Verso's ending is the most fitting and the most ethical. After a long journey, it's finally time to say goodbye, both fictionally and in real life. It still contains a lot of ethical concerns, such as the horrible way in which Mael's family likely continues to treat her. And Mael also returns to a version of her body that can't speak and is disfigured, though I'll avoid diving too deep into disability and related topics for now. Regardless, there's enough silver lining here that I'd be content with this bittersweet resolution, especially since Mael can always paint another canvas with her own brand of personal escapism, free from her destructive parents. And since she's almost an adult, she could always leave home and turn her life and her art into whatever future she sees fit. However, there is a complicated angle to this idea regarding to what extent Mael and Verso each value the sentience of young Verso's partial soul, which is the power source allowing the canvas to exist. Which brings us to question 2. How much value do we assign to young Verso's partial soul? Considering that the game may or may not pitch the concept of canvases as the forced slavery of a part of the painter's soul, it's hard to picture Mael damning a part of her own soul to that life by painting any more canvases, unless she does not view these partial souls as worthy of any sentient value. This is all an extremely similar concept to the TV show Severance, although since Expedition 33 uses the overt language of souls to describe these beings, it seems pretty clear that this is an indefensible existence to morally support, unless it's interpreted that something about this partial soul is more poetic than literal, and maybe less than the sum of its parts. Like, are they more of an echo of the original person? Do they have agency? Are they just on autopilot? Does a partial soul have as much value as a full soul, let alone a full soul attached to a complete mind? It's quite possible that they are truly sentient and that all painters, no matter how kind they appear, are still each living such a godlike life that they simply can't empathize with something nobody around them values. Similarly to someone choosing to undergo the severance procedure without any care toward the new severed consciousness that is going to be abused. However, one thing lending credence to that maybe these partial souls aren't quite as living as full ones is that his appearance mirrors that of any of the humans who have spent too much time in the canvas, losing their sense of self and showing visual deterioration on their bodies and featuring an empty black hole instead of facial features. So, I would think his initial appearance would be far less horrific, much more human, and possibly very on board with his newfound godly existence. After all, if you open your eyes for the first time and realize you're a god with limitless power, would you actually be upset about it? It is also suggested through dialogue with young Verso that painting this world did bring him joy until Aline and Renoir cascaded suffering across it. Maëlle has also presumably made many canvases before, meaning parts of her soul have been scattered across many worlds, and she is seemingly unfazed by that. It may be possible to interpret all of this as that the problem is not the concept of creating canvas worlds powered by partial soul copies, but of abusing them for selfish intent. And since the idea of putting a part of your soul into your art is a very positive metaphor in our own world, I don't necessarily think we're intended to think this concept is horrendously offensive across the board. Plus, we see what are presumably partial souls of Clea and Renoir across the canvas too, likely because they painted many creatures within the canvas. So there's reason to believe painters leave parts of their souls in whatever art they create, and I don't really think the game wants us to interpret that in an entirely negative way. Another thing is that it's somewhat unclear what motivation Painted Verso has for wanting to free the partial soul. One thing for sure is that it's at least in part due to seeing him as part of himself. In addition, it could be because the partial soul has been corrupted by Aline and Renoir's destruction, or alternatively, because he finds the very concept of these captive beings to be immoral. Considering he tells Maëlle that everything will be okay because she can just paint other canvases, I don't think he's doing this for the liberation of partial souls across the board. Like many actions he's taken, his choices in the climax of the game are inherently selfish, no matter what way you slice it. His moral center has been corrupted by being forced to live an unnaturally long life full of suffering inflicted by a selfish family, infecting him with their illness. The cycle of grief has consumed him, leading him to want to rest more than anything, to the point of choosing to let Gustave die just to make sure he didn't get in the way, and then manipulating Maëlle, Ciel, and Lune to do what needed to be done in order to achieve his goal of expelling his mother and Renoir from the canvas, which he knew very well would result in the deaths of himself, his traveling companions, and the rest of the world's inhabitants. If you ask me, I think he's extremely sad and has truly lost the ability to empathize or value life. Just like his parents before him, he is painting the world around him black with his grief. No matter what Painted Verso's ethical center is, the value of young Verso's partial soul is the biggest hurdle in supporting the ethics of Maëlle's ending. Still assuming the painted characters are not sentient here, if you don't assign much value to the partial soul, or if you think that after Aline and Renoir are gone that he'd thrive again, I think siding with Maëlle would be a valid choice in which you view the world and the artificial characters within to be a more compelling experience than Maëlle's real life. There are some concerns with if it's healthy to spend so much time with an artificial recreation of your dead brother, but the most concerning aspect is still that the world's existence is powered by a part of someone's soul, forced to paint forever, possibly against their will. If you as the player give any sort of living value to Verso's partial soul, it becomes very hard to defend preserving a canvas in which painted characters are simply illusory. Because by destroying the canvas, you'd harm no one, but by leaving it around, you'd become complicit in forcing a living being to continue being a slave for an indefinite amount of time.
Please. Thank you. Stop him from painting.
Don't say that. Please, don't say that.
Aside from Verso's partial soul, if you view the painted characters as purely fictional, it dodges a lot of the ethical complications present in alternative interpretations, but, depending on who you ask, also removes a lot of narrative weight. However, none of the moral philosophy in these musings hold up if you interpret the painted characters inside the canvas as sentient. Now that all of the groundwork has been laid, it's time to talk about the real meat and potatoes moral dilemma of the game's ending, in which we assume that the painted characters are just as sentient as anyone from the real world. In this interpretation, the game asks whether it's justifiable to destroy an entire world of sentient beings so that one enslaved partial soul can finally rest, and so one family of selfish gods can face their grief. As you may have intuited from the way I phrased that, I feel pretty strongly that if the inhabitants of the canvas are indeed sentient, there is no way to morally justify killing them for almost any reason. But it's a very complicated topic, so let's get into it. When I was first presented with the final choice in the game, I thought for a few moments and then very confidently sided with Maëlle, as it seems a lot of people did when they first reached this moment. No matter the revelations about young Verso's soul, I just could not think of any way to morally justify erasing an entire world of souls for the sake of him, especially since Mael had just spent 40 hours fighting for their right to live and even partially convinced Renoir to support her. I then annihilated Verso with some sick moves and teared up as he faded away, a tragic victim of a broken family, driven to existential nihilism after 100 years of suffering.
Unpaint me. Unpaint me.
So,
Please. I don't want this life.
stop saying
I
that.
don't want this life. I don't want this life.
I then watched the epilogue, and it was lovely to see Gustave and the residents of Lumière resurrected, gathering to enjoy a simple concert. It was nice, although fairly quick compared to the cathartic reunion I was expecting from such an emotional game. Then an aged-up Verso stepped on stage, which was confusing at first. Then we got the super jarring piano stinger, implying that Mael's external body is succumbing to the sickness associated with staying in canvases for too long. Verso's expression also implied discontentment with continuing to exist in this world, and since the last time we saw him he was begging Mael to let him die, this led to a lot of conflicted feelings. Then the game ended. I won't lie to you, I found this ending very unsatisfying in the moment, and to some extent I still do. After receiving it, I of course opened YouTube and watched Verso's ending. To my surprise, it was incredibly emotional and felt appropriately tragic. However, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the only way to get this ending in the moment is by choosing to fight for Verso's moral perspective, which I just could not bring myself to do since it involves erasing an entire world of sentient beings. This led to a lot of conflicted feelings, and it seems I'm not alone in that. Many players who chose the Mael ending and then watched Verso's ending after declared that Mael's is the bad ending because she didn't learn her lesson that escapism comes at great cost, and that Verso's is the good ending since Mael learned her lesson and confronts grief head-on. While I strongly disagree that either ending is intended to be good or bad, I can't deny the validity of this reaction. One ending's editing, music, and tone seem to punish you for your choice and make you feel discontentment, and the other rewards you with a bittersweet goodbye. However, like I said at the start of this video, this is only what the music and cinematic language are suggesting you feel. When we look below the surface of both endings, we see that the facts don't exactly line up with these interpretations. In Verso's ending, the tone suggests to us that in order to successfully process loss, you need to cut all ties to escapist activities and embrace the hardships of the grieving process. But when you think about what that actually means in the concept of the story, it becomes a lot more morally problematic. Which again is fine as a tragic ending in which Mael's virtues are defeated by Painted Verso, who is a victim to a corrupt family's grief, but if you don't morally support Verso, you won't choose to fight as him, and then you are prevented from seeing this ending at all. One concerning aspect of this ending is that in order to grieve, the Desandre family have chosen to erase the last part of Verso they have left. And I'm not talking specifically about his partial soul. I mean they are destroying the legacy of their dead son in the form of his artwork, what they have to remember him by. I'm no mental health expert, but I can't imagine any therapist supporting throwing away your dead son's artwork as a way to process your grief. Obviously, it's a lot more complex than that since the power of this particular art is all-consuming, but I still find the messaging of this to be morally concerning. This ending is also an all-or-nothing approach, and I'm sure we'd all agree that even if a form of escapism can be consuming to the level of hurting our normal lives, completely cutting it out isn't always the answer. Moderation is key. For example, I was addicted to playing Expedition 33. I probably should have limited my playing time, but I wasn't strong enough to do so. Cutting it out of my life entirely wouldn't be a great solution either, because then I'd miss out on one of my most favorite video games I've ever played. Thankfully, narrative video games are temporary, so now that I 100%ed it, I'm free from its grasp for a while, and that grasp will never be as strong as it was when I didn't know what would happen next in the story. It was pretty addicting. Mael's ending, in my opinion, has more focus on moderation, but Verso's ending is a sledgehammer approach. The biggest problematic element in Verso's ending is of course the killing of every living being inside the canvas. Humans both before Expedition 33 and after. All of Mael's friends, every Gestrel and Grandis, every Nevron, Esquier and Francois, and whatever wildlife may exist. I feel like I don't have to say much about this. If we interpret the painted characters in the canvas as sentient or as having souls, killing them is immoral, full stop. However, where this gets at least a little complicated is when you add in the context of the state of the world. For one, Renoir has already committed the actual genocide. Over 67 years he's been gommaging countless people, and now that he's free, he's gommaged the rest of them. Which means, as far as human lives go, Verso isn't directly responsible for their deaths. Technically, he's not directly responsible for any of them, since Renoir is always the one gommaging them, and will be the one to gommage Ciel, Lune, Esquier, and Monoko. But Verso is still an accomplice to a monster in this scenario. Though I will argue that since Verso manipulated the party to defeat the Paintress, it is ultimately his fault that Renoir was able to complete his ultimate gommage, so still pretty guilty in my book. For me, the most disturbing part of this is that fighting as Verso means that you, the player, are endorsing this. You're endorsing the erasure of a world of sentient beings so that young Verso's partial soul can rest, and so the Dessandres can process their grief. There are a few other elements that can reduce the intensity of this horrible action, though. The big one we already covered, which is that if you interpret Verso's partial soul as an enslaved being, there is of course a moral compromise in saving the world, because you're also forcing him to keep painting. So, if we on planet Earth learn that our world only exists because some deity on another plane of existence is being forced to keep us alive, I don't really think most humans would roll over and accept our demise so that the deity could be free. It's a classic trolley problem, which I can't answer for you, but for me, I'm still inclined to choose the millions of Earth's inhabitants and future inhabitants over one abstract deity that I have no personal connection to and cannot see. If I could go there and saw that it was a piece of my brother's soul, maybe I'd cave and make the call, but I don't think it would be morally defensible. It would be incredibly selfish of me, probably the most selfish decision in the history of the world. Another element that could lessen the genocidal implications of destroying the canvas is the question of when you resurrect or reconstruct a person, they're actually the same person, or if they're just a copy containing the same molecular configuration all the way down to their memories. The game doesn't ever suggest that the resurrected Lune and Ciel could be copies, but I think it's fair if somebody wants to make this argument, especially since the game does bring up the topic of Gestrals not really being the same Gestral when resurrected.
We can bring Noko back to life. But not all of Noko will return. It will be a different Noko. The one you knew is gone.
If repainting gommaged souls does mean that they're just copies of the original humans, it does lessen the horrific nature of Verso's decision at the very least. Even if we ignore all these resurrection concerns and assume that reversing the gommage restores everyone's original souls, which I do think the game suggests, you still need to ask the question of whether preventing someone from being resurrected is the same as killing them. It could also possibly be argued that fabricated worlds, even if they contain sentience, can't necessarily be held to the exact same value as the world of its creators. If we as a species become advanced enough that we develop VR simulations containing sentience, it's a very challenging question of if they matter as much as the people in our world. Will we be expected to keep those worlds running for infinity? If you accidentally cause a power surge that restarts the servers, should you be arrested for mass murder? Should you betray the mental health of your family in favor of the inhabitants of those worlds? Hard to say. Especially if the sentience of those beings is up for debate. And let's be frank, our own sentience is unproven. We don't even know what it means to be sentient, and the concept of a soul was created by us via religious mythology to fill a gap in our knowledge. So at some level, assuming something isn't sentient without proof is gambling with potential life. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it could be a very realistic simulation of a duck, but it could also be a duck. So maybe it could be argued that godlike beings viewing their creations as lesser than them is somewhat understandable, but that logic could be used to defend the ethics of any JRPG villain ever, and that doesn't undo the fact that the tiny humans fighting back with the power of friendship still have every right to, and more often than not, will very easily earn our empathy over the gods they are fighting. Even if we buy into every potential argument I just listed in favor of supporting Verso's morality, and you successfully avoid viewing the choice as supporting human genocide, one pitfall still remains. You are still choosing to end all of the non-human lives in the canvas against their will. As much as we humans are capable of shrugging off the massive amounts of animals we kill every year for food, resources, and sport, I highly doubt anyone watching this video would be comfortable pressing a button that ended all animal lives on planet Earth, in addition to a handful of your close human friends and lovable flying man thing who do not want to die. Other than morality, as far as how this ending plays with the overall narrative, I do have one issue with it. The themes explored early in the game were not directly about grief, they were about mortality and how we choose to spend the limited time we have together. It's not like there's a big jump to get from mortality to grief, but I do think there's a bit of a problem in not tying the themes of the finale of a story into where it came from, and I don't really think this ending comes full circle in that regard. However, I do think these themes are much more present in Mael's ending. At first glance, there's no getting around that Mael's ending feels wrong, but I find it very hard to believe that the writers of the game would put so much effort into making the final moral choice so difficult and making us choose a side between two of our own party members, only to label one as good and one as bad. I would bet money that if you asked Sandfall about this, they'd say that both choices are valid and that they don't want to skew our interpretations with their personal intentions, and that the art is what we make of it. With that in mind, I think it becomes fairly easy to find a lot of happiness in Mael's ending, even if the music and editing discourages us from doing so. The core of my argument is that most of the dire warnings given to Mael from Renoir and Verso about how staying in the canvas will destroy her are incredibly biased extremes colored by their personal grief. In addition to this, Alicia, with the help of her experience as Mael, has proven over the course of the story that she is not her parents, or the Alicia she used to be. She's learned so much about grieving growing up in Lumiere. She was surrounded by altruistic role models that taught her how to be a good person, free from her previous self where all her life experiences were rooted in the influence of wealthy demigods. She's not going to go insane from the abuse of power Aline succumbed to.
I'm not, Mum. I'm not going to lose myself if I stay.
Mael may not have completely mastered the grieving process, but she's much further along than anyone else in her family, and she only got there because she spent time in this canvas away from them. For Mael, the escapism actually really helps begin to heal her.
You think you know what's at stake, but you don't.
I know precisely what's at stake. You want control. You want to feel like you're doing something. You couldn't save Verso, so you want to save us, except you're not. Destroying the canvas won't help us move on. It'll just deny us the one place that helped us feel again.
One warning Renoir keeps throwing at Mael is that she'll get sick if she stays in the canvas for too long, and the epilogue suggests that this is true by dropping that piano stinger and showing us a glimpse into her real-life painted sickness in its very final moment. However, the game, via Clea, directly tells us that 67 years in the canvas actually isn't that long.
They've spent longer than this in other canvases. It's not that dire.
I repeat, 67 canvas years is not that long. That's essentially a full human life of experience. Plus, 67 years is how long Renoir was there, and he hasn't gone insane like Aline has, who was there much longer. And since Aline and Renoir have totally normal-looking faces at Verso's funeral, it really doesn't seem to have taken that big of a toll. So, contrary to what the editing of the ending implies, if Mael spends a few decades in the canvas, it really doesn't seem like a big deal. Which implies that Renoir isn't all that worried about her external body's health, he just doesn't want his family to spend even more time separated, which causes him to paint all risks with a broad brush, and does not acknowledge the differences between Aline and Mael.
I'm not leaving you forever. Just a little longer.
Plus, you know what happens to humans after a few decades? Our bodies and minds deteriorate. It's like this sickness is just a metaphor for age. And living a few good decades without the burden of the Dissandras destroying the livelihoods of those within the canvas is literally what all the expeditions have been fighting for the entire time. They won. This is a happy ending for the inhabitants of the canvas almost objectively. Mael fought for and won a little more time with those she loves. And even though her time there may be fleeting, it's a sacrifice she's making for everyone else, for those who come after. And even though she might get lost in the world a bit more than she's anticipating, I just really don't think what's waiting for her in the world outside is any better, and to choose the outside world over the canvas comes at the cost of so much life inside the canvas being ended. As far as how much the game goes out of its way to tell us that spending decades in canvases is not a big deal, I do feel very confused on why they'd try so hard in this ending to make this sickness such a dour focus, to the point of literally cutting to credits as we contemplate how awful it seems. It makes me wonder if every moral point the game is making has a contrarian alternative by design to make it more conflicting. But I also wonder if some of this could just be logical inconsistencies in the writing that may have emerged as the writers buckled under the immense pressure of maintaining world building across such a complex story. We'll probably never know the answer to that, and that's also certainly not a dig at the writers since they did an exceptional job across the board. Another thing, the concept of canvases within canvases is brought up during the game, meaning who's to say the real world is even the top layer?
Well, since we mere mortals can't leave this canvas, Mael has kindly offered to paint the outside world for me, so I can see a painting inside this painting.
It might not be the same exact logic, but if we start invalidating worlds within worlds as being less meaningful than the top one, we're at risk of invalidating our own world's value. If the world inside the canvas is indistinguishable from Mael's world, I say she has every right to choose which world has her best interests at heart, and I don't personally think it's the one with her family in it, where she can't speak and is disfigured. Of course, it's great to find inner peace with disabilities, but if someone disabled tells you they're happier in a VR world indistinguishable from reality, and that they're only going to spend a limited amount of time there to make sure it doesn't totally destroy their real-world health, who are we to tell them no? Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, Verso being resurrected. It's a common takeaway that in this ending, Verso has essentially been ungomaged by Mael against his will to be a sort of slave puppet, because Mael can't deal with her grief. I think that this is a valid interpretation, even though I have a hard time believing that the Mael we know could do such a horrific thing. My personal interpretation is a lot less problematic, though. There's one line spoken by Mael over a black screen right before the epilogue that I'd like to draw your attention to.
If you could grow old, would you find a reason to smile?
I don't know if this is something Mael literally said to Verso, or if it's just a poetic moment conveying inner thoughts, but I interpret this as Mael asking Verso for consent. Even if it wasn't answered by him, I still stand by this action, because when your friend has an existential panic attack and asks you to kill him, generally the morally accepted response is to not do it. To, at the very least, make sure they have more time to consider this rash decision. Implied by Verso's aged appearance and that line spoken by Mael, it seems pretty concrete that this version of Verso is mortal, meaning he could take the exit ramp any day he wants. So to me, Verso's conflicted expression isn't anger, it's more to express his feelings on the state of reality that they all continue to occupy. He knows there's consequences and spares a moment to take stock of their lives. He looks at Ciel and Lune, who appear happier than we've ever seen them. He then looks at Mael and contemplates how she's sacrificing parts of her quote-unquote real life in order to be there with them. But again, based on the mountain of arguments the game gives us to make these concerns seem fairly trivial, I choose to look past the intensity of the piano sting and view the scene in a more positive light. After a moment, Verso begins to play the piano and bask in the art he now has time to create, even if he still fails to enjoy it as much as everyone else. In my opinion, even though he still struggles, he understands that the world and its inhabitants were worth saving. Although, I'll fully admit that the game does foreshadow this moment pretty heavily after Mael gomages painted Alicia, in a way that does make Mael seem a bit hypocritical for not honoring Verso's wish to die.
It's what she wanted. I owed her that much.
Counterpoint to that, though, so does Verso.
You didn't wait. You didn't give me a chance to persuade her.
Despite the valid concerns about Verso's resurrection, I think focusing on that as the biggest takeaway from this ending detracts from the immense good that Mael has done here. No matter how dire the futures of Mael and Verso end up being, Mael's choices here still saved an entire world's worth of souls. Generations of expeditions compounded upon each other, allowing Expedition 33 to succeed and ensure the survival of life in the only world any of them have ever known. As much as I defend the morality of Mael's ending, I can't deny that, as is, the editing pushes us to feel disappointment from it, which I find quite odd. It confuses me that when they went to such lengths to provide such a complicated moral choice, I would think they'd make sure both endings justify the player's choice, regardless of which it is. Especially considering that the ending that feels cathartic is the one where the player chooses one family's grief over the survival of an entire world of souls, and the one where you save them leaves us feeling like we did something wrong. Is it contrarian just to stir the pot? Or maybe the writers don't view the inhabitants of the canvas as truly sentient and are trying to make a point? Or maybe to the French, Mael's ending is more satisfying than it is to an American audience? Of course, it could also be argued that because the whole world bears the burden of the Desandra family's grief, that maybe it's a mercy to simply let it end, since it's so far gone that it would be such an uphill battle to save it.
Our whole world carries the burden of your family's grief.
Maybe we're not intended to think this deeply about all these complex moral issues because the state of this once joyful world has shifted downward so drastically. But for me, that's a pretty pessimistic view when the path to saving it has been clearly outlined. This conundrum reminds me of the speech Auron gives in Final Fantasy X.
Now is the time to choose. Die and be free of pain, or live and fight your sorrow. Now is the time to shape your stories. Your fate is in your hands!
To side with Verso, to me, feels like listening to this speech and then being like, nah, I'ma do my own thing. And choosing to side with Mael is to embrace that classic JRPG energy and fight against the gods to preserve the life of your friends. And yet when you do that, it's like you're then told, actually, that mindset is not as cool as it seems. Which is so odd when there is so much evidence in the game pointing out how Mael has found a lot of peace in this world that her parents and sister have not, and that the downsides to staying in the canvas for a few decades in canvas years actually isn't that dangerous, and really Renoir's warnings were quite biased due to his immense grief. So there's just conflicting messages across the board, and I'm still torn on how that actually makes me feel. Maybe on a second playthrough, I'll choose to fight as Verso, even though I morally support Mael, just so that I'll get that tragically cathartic ending where the Desandra's grief was so strong that it corrupted the world and painted Verso, to the point where Mael loses the one thing that was helping her find peace with her grief. It would feel weird fighting as Verso, but plenty of games, such as The Last of Us, rely heavily on forcing the player to take actions they don't morally agree with. Guilt is a powerful tool in game writing, but it's still frustrating that to see this tragic ending within the game, you'd have to know what was coming, and make a choice contrary to your actual moral beliefs. And I do kind of find that to be a problem with how the game's final choice and the endings that follow were executed. Especially since this was a game covered in sorrow, tragedy kind of fits, and by having the endings be a choice over which moral opinion wins, they lock you out of the option of getting a tragic ending. And yet, when a narrative compels us to get this introspective and ask this many existential questions, I can't really be too hard on it. The cruel choice we're forced to make and the resolutions that follow are extremely risky, and causes the game's narrative to stick in our heads far longer than a more straightforward execution would, even if I would have felt more traditional catharsis in the moment. Expedition 33 asks the audience to do some hard work in finding their moral center, which is something very few games these days dare to do. I do still long for a third ending that gives me more catharsis and validates my headcanon, combining elements from both endings into one smorgasbord of emotions that allows the canvas to remain in existence, and also has Mael choosing to leave after a while, though maybe occasionally coming back for a visit. All of this can still happen in my interpretation of Mael's ending, but I just wish I got to see it. And as much as I'd love a DLC that takes place after Mael's ending, easing us out of the world more slowly and positively, I really don't think the artists that created this morally ambiguous narrative have any interest in adopting one ending as more valid than the other. Not to mention that anyone on Team Verso might feel conflicted even considering playing it, when they don't support the morality of Mael's ending, and that just wouldn't be a good business move for Sandfall. All in all, Expedition 33 is easily one of the best games I've ever played, and its 2 resolutions have made me more introspective than any other game out there, and I think that's worthy of so much celebration.